I went from shaking my boss's hand to questioning my entire career in less than 24 hours. And at 4:52 p.m. yesterday, I thought I was finally stepping into the life I'd worked for. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 29 years old. And until recently, I was a senior analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Chicago, the kind of place with glass conference rooms, burnt coffee in the break room, and motivational quotes framed on beige walls. I had been there for 3 years, putting in 60-hour weeks, skipping happy hours, double-checking every spreadsheet down to the last decimal, telling myself that if I just kept my head down and delivered, someone would notice. Yesterday, someone did. When Mark Henderson's assistant emailed me at 4:37 p.m. asking if I could stop by for a quick chat, my stomach tightened the way it always does before a performance review, but I grabbed my notebook and walked the 30 feet from my cubicle to his corner office pretending I wasn't rehearsing every possible outcome in my head. Mark didn't waste time. He stood up, walked around his desk, and said, "Congratulations, Ethan. We're promoting you to team lead." For a second, I honestly thought I misheard him. The air felt lighter, like someone had opened a window. He told me the decision had been finalized that morning, that senior leadership was impressed with the way I handled the Westbrook account, that they needed someone dependable to guide the team into the next quarter. I remember noticing the city skyline behind him, the late afternoon sun reflecting off the buildings, and thinking this was the moment people talk about when they say hard work pays off. I shook his hand, probably too firmly, and thanked him more times than necessary. The raise wasn't massive, but it was real. The title change meant authority. It meant respect. It meant I wasn't just another guy in a gray cubicle anymore. When I walked back to my desk, I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Jason Reed, who sits across from me, looked up and said, "You good?" And I tried to act casual, but the grin gave me away. Within minutes, the news started to circulate. Mark must have told a few managers, because people began stopping by to say congratulations. Handshakes, quick hugs, even a couple of jokes about how I'd better not forget them when I made it big. Olivia Brooks came over last. She smiled, tilted her head slightly, and said, "Wow, team lead. That's impressive." Her tone was smooth, perfectly professional, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite read. Olivia and I had been hired the same year. We'd both led major projects. If I'm being honest, I knew she probably wanted this role too. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. Promotions create tension. That's normal. By 5:30 p.m., most people were packing up. Jason insisted we grab a drink at the bar downstairs. We clinked glasses, and he said, "You earned this, man." I believed him. I texted my parents. I called my older sister during her commute. I even updated the title in my LinkedIn draft, hovering over the save button, but deciding to wait until the official announcement went out the next morning. On my train ride home, 35 minutes north, I replayed the conversation with Mark at least a dozen times. I thought about how I would run my first team meeting, how I'd prove they made the right choice, how this was just the beginning. Around 9:15 p.m., I opened my laptop at my kitchen table to glance over a few files for the Westbrook account, wanting everything to look perfect for my first day as team lead. I felt focused, motivated, almost unstoppable. At 9:47 p.m., an email notification popped up that would start unraveling everything. But at that exact moment, staring at my screen in a quiet apartment lit by a single lamp, I still believed I was ending the best day of my career. The email subject line read "Urgent Review Required," and it was sent at 9:47 p.m. from our chief financial officer with Mark and 2 senior directors copied, which immediately made my chest tighten. I clicked it expecting a minor clarification about the Westbrook account, maybe a formatting issue or a small projection adjustment. But instead I saw the words "material discrepancy" in Q3 forecast highlighted in bold. The message was short and formal, stating that during a late review of the updated financial model, several revenue projections tied to Westbrook appeared to be overstated by nearly $200,000 for the upcoming quarter, and that the team lead responsible would need to address this first thing. In the morning, my name was written clearly in the final sentence. I stared at the number for a full 10 seconds, convinced it had to be a misunderstanding. $200,000 is not a rounding error. It is not a misplaced decimal. It is the kind of number that makes executives nervous. My first reaction was confusion, not fear. I had triple-checked that model. I had built it cell by cell, formula by formula, over the course of 3 late nights the previous week. I opened the file on my laptop and scrolled straight to the Revenue tab. The numbers looked exactly the way I remembered them. The totals aligned. The formulas referenced the correct ranges. I even pulled up the archived version I had submitted at 3:12 p.m. earlier that day. Same projections. Same totals. Nothing close to a $200,000 inflation. I went back to the email and noticed an attachment labeled revised_Westbrook_Q3_final. That was strange. I had not sent a revised version after 3 in the afternoon. I downloaded it and opened the spreadsheet. At first glance, it looked identical, but when I navigated to the forecast summary, my stomach dropped. The projected subscription growth rate had been adjusted upward by almost 4%, and a cost reduction assumption had been quietly altered, shifting the bottom line significantly. It was subtle enough that someone skimming would assume it was my work, but it was not what I had submitted. I checked the document properties. The last modified time read 11:58 p.m., and the author field displayed my name. I felt a rush of heat in my face. I had not touched that file at 11:58. In fact, at that time I had been brushing my teeth and getting ready for bed. I scrolled through the version history in our shared drive, but access to earlier drafts appeared restricted. The system showed only the latest file as active. I leaned back in my chair and tried to slow my breathing. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone from finance had adjusted assumptions for scenario planning. Maybe the file had been renamed automatically. I drafted a reply explaining that I would review the numbers first thing in the morning and clarify any discrepancies, careful to keep my tone calm and professional. I did not accuse anyone. I did not defend myself too aggressively. I simply stated that I would investigate. After hitting send, I checked the time. It was 10:26 p.m. The excitement from earlier that evening felt distant, almost naive. I reopened my original archived file and compared it line by line with the revised version for nearly an hour, noting every change. The differences were deliberate, not accidental. Around 11:30 p.m., I considered texting Mark, but I stopped myself. Reaching out that late could look panicked. Instead, I told myself that in the morning I would walk into the office early, explain the situation clearly, and resolve it before it escalated. I closed my laptop just after midnight, but sleep did not come easily. I lay awake replaying the promotion conversation in my head, wondering how a day that started with a handshake and congratulations could end with a question mark hanging over my name. I woke up at 5:12 a.m. after what felt like barely 2 hours of real sleep, staring at the ceiling and replaying every cell in that spreadsheet in my head as if I could will the numbers to rearrange themselves. By 6 a.m., I was already dressed, standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand, rereading the email from the chief financial officer and my own carefully worded reply. There were no new messages, no clarification, no reassurance, just silence. I left my apartment before sunrise and caught the 6:28 train downtown, choosing a seat by the window but barely noticing the passing neighborhoods. My mind kept circling back to that modified growth rate and the 11:58 timestamp. When I reached the office at 7:15 a.m., the floor was almost empty, the overhead lights brighter than usual against the quiet. I walked straight to my desk, logged into my computer, and immediately opened the shared drive. The revised file was still there, still bearing my name as the last editor. I checked the access log again, but instead of the detailed version history I expected, the system displayed a permissions message stating that historical edits were restricted to administrators. That had never happened before. I opened my archived version from the previous afternoon and began comparing it side by side with the revised one, documenting every altered assumption in a separate document. At 7:42 a.m., a calendar notification appeared. Emergency financial review. 8:30 a.m., conference room B. Required attendees included Mark Henderson, the chief financial officer, 2 senior directors, Claire Simmons from Human Resources, Olivia Brooks, and me. My pulse quickened when I saw Olivia's name. There was no clear reason she needed to be there unless this was about more than just correcting numbers. Jason arrived around 8:05 a.m. and noticed the tension on my face. He asked if everything was okay, and I told him there was a discrepancy in the Westbrook forecast that I needed to clarify. He frowned and said that Olivia had been in early too, which struck me as unusual because she normally arrived closer to 9. I tried not to read into it. At 8:27 a.m., I walked toward conference room B with my laptop tucked under my arm, rehearsing what I would say. I planned to start by explaining that the file I submitted at 3:12 p.m. did not contain the revised assumptions and that I had evidence to show the differences. I told myself to stay calm, to focus on facts, not emotions. When I entered the room, everyone was already seated. Mark sat at the head of the table. The chief financial officer had a printed copy of the spreadsheet in front of him with several sections highlighted in yellow. Claire from Human Resources sat quietly with a notepad. Olivia was on the right side of the table, hands folded neatly, expression neutral. The atmosphere felt heavier than any routine meeting I had attended. Mark gestured for me to take the empty chair near the screen. He did not smile. He did not congratulate me again. He simply said, "We need to talk about the Westbrook projections." The chief financial officer began by outlining the discrepancy, emphasizing the nearly $200,000 impact on the quarterly forecast and the potential consequences of presenting inflated expectations to the client. Hearing the numbers spoken aloud in that room made it feel even larger, more serious. I waited for a pause and then explained that the version I submitted did not include those adjustments and that I believed the file had been modified after I logged off. The chief financial officer turned the printed pages toward me and pointed to the author field, which clearly displayed my name along with the 1158 timestamp. He asked, calmly but firmly, if I was, suggesting that someone else had accessed my credentials. For a moment, I realized how this sounded. The new team lead, less than 24 hours into the role, already deflecting responsibility. I opened my laptop and prepared to show the archived version I had saved, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether this was a simple correction or the beginning of something far worse. I connected my laptop to the conference room screen with hands that felt steady only because I forced them to be, and I pulled up the archived version of the Westbrook model that I had saved at 3:12 p.m. the previous afternoon. The spreadsheet filled the display, rows and columns I knew as well as my own reflection. I navigated directly to the Revenue Forecast tab and pointed out the subscription growth rate, the cost assumptions, and the final projected total. I explained that this was the file I had completed before leaving the office and that the projections here did not match the ones highlighted in the revised version. The chief financial officer leaned forward and asked me to scroll to the document properties. I did, and the last modified time showed 3:12 p.m. with my name listed as the author. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of relief. This was proof that a different version had existed. However, when I attempted to open the version history through the shared drive, the system again displayed the restricted access notice. Mark cleared his throat and said that the only active file on record within the shared environment was the one modified at 11:58 p.m., and that from an audit standpoint, that was the version tied to my credentials. The implications settled over the room like a weight. Olivia spoke for the first time, her tone measured and calm. She said that she had reviewed the model earlier in the afternoon before the promotion announcement, and that she remembered the assumptions being aggressive but within reason, and that she was surprised to see the updated projections later that night when she received the automated notification of changes. The word updated caught my attention. I asked what notification she meant, and she replied that our system alerts team members when significant financial models are revised after business hours. I had never received such an alert for my own file. The chief financial officer asked whether anyone else had access to my login credentials. I answered no, explaining that I do not share passwords and that my laptop had been with me all evening. Claire from Human Resources interjected gently, saying that regardless of intent, the appearance of inflated projections less than 24 hours after a leadership promotion created a serious optics issue for the firm. Hearing it framed that way made my promotion sound like a mistake rather than an achievement. I felt heat rising in my face, but kept my voice steady. I said that I understood the gravity of the situation and that I welcomed a full review of system logs to determine how the file had been modified. The chief financial officer nodded and said that information technology would be asked to investigate, but until then, leadership needed assurance that the Westbrook account was not at risk. Mark looked directly at me and asked whether I could confidently state that the original assumptions were accurate and defensible in front of the client. I answered yes without hesitation. The numbers in my archive file were conservative and supported by historical data. He then asked whether I accepted responsibility for the discrepancy currently attached to my name. That question hung in the air longer than any spreadsheet cell ever had. If I said yes, I would be admitting fault for changes I did not make. If I said no, I risked sounding defensive and unaccountable. I chose my words carefully and said that I accepted responsibility for ensuring the integrity of my work and that I believed the integrity of the file had been compromised after I logged off. Silence followed. No one accused me outright, but no one defended me either. Mark finally concluded that the client presentation scheduled for Friday would be postponed and that my leadership transition would be temporarily placed on hold pending review. The phrase temporarily placed on hold echoed in my mind. Less than a day earlier, I had been congratulated as the new team lead. Now I was sitting in the same office, under fluorescent lights, watching that title slip into uncertainty while everyone avoided direct eye contact. When the meeting ended at 9:14 a.m., no one lingered. Chairs slid back quietly, papers were gathered, and the room emptied with a level of restraint that felt rehearsed. I unplugged my laptop from the screen and walked out last, aware of how the hallway outside conference room B suddenly felt longer than usual. A few coworkers glanced up from their desks as I passed, their expressions polite but cautious, as if I had become a headline they were still trying to interpret. I returned to my cubicle and sat down slowly, replaying every sentence that had been said, temporarily placed on hold. The words echoed in my head like a verdict that had not yet been finalized, but had already shaped perception. At 9:22 a.m., I received an automated notification that my access to the Westbrook shared folder had been restricted pending review. It was procedural, I told myself. Standard practice. Still, seeing that message made the situation feel official. Jason leaned over the divider and asked how the meeting went. I hesitated for half a second before answering that leadership wanted to review some numbers before moving forward. He studied my face and nodded, clearly sensing there was more to the story. Around 9:40 a.m., Olivia walked past my desk on her way to the break room. She paused just long enough to say, "I hope everything gets sorted out," her tone sympathetic but distant. I thanked her, searching her expression for any sign of guilt or discomfort, but she remained composed. I opened my archive document again, even though I no longer had permission to update anything, and began writing a detailed timeline in a separate file on my personal drive. 3:12 p.m., final submission. 4:37 p.m., meeting request from Mark. 4:52 p.m., promotion confirmed. 9:47 p.m., discrepancy email received. 11:58 p.m., revised file modified under my name. I included screenshots, saved copies, and documented every difference between the two versions. If this was going to turn into an investigation, I wanted to be prepared. At 10:30 a.m., Claire from Human Resources stopped by my desk and asked if I had a moment. We stepped into a small conference room near the elevators. She explained that this was not a disciplinary meeting, but a fact-finding conversation. She asked me to walk through my evening step by step, including where I was, whether anyone else had access to my laptop, and whether I had ever shared my login credentials. I answered each question calmly and directly. I told her I had been home alone in my apartment, that my laptop had remained with me, and that I had never shared my password with anyone. She took notes carefully, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking for clarification on timestamps. When I mentioned the restricted version history and the automated notification Olivia claimed to receive, Claire's pen paused for a moment before continuing. She thanked me and said the information technology team would review system logs within the next 24 hours. As I walked back to my desk, I noticed that my inbox was quieter than usual. Fewer emails, fewer direct messages. It was subtle, but I could feel the shift. People were cautious about attaching themselves to uncertainty. By lunchtime, the news had clearly spread beyond the conference room. Two colleagues who had congratulated me the day before avoided eye contact in the hallway. I overheard fragments of conversation near the printers that stopped abruptly when I approached. The promotion that had felt like validation now felt like exposure. Around 1:15 p.m., Mark sent a brief email to the department stating that leadership transitions were being reassessed due to financial review processes. My name was not mentioned, but it did not need to be. I stared at the screen for a long time, realizing that in less than 24 hours, I had moved from rising leader to unresolved question, and the day was not even half over. By 2 p.m., the office felt colder than it had that morning. even though the thermostat had not changed. I sat at my desk reviewing the timeline I had created, adding precise details down to the minute, trying to anchor myself in facts instead of speculation. At 2:17 p.m., I received a message from Information Technology requesting that I bring my laptop to their department for a routine log review. The wording was neutral, but the implication was clear. I carried my laptop down the hallway, aware of how exposed I felt walking past rows of desks that had been my normal environment for 3 years. In the Information Technology office, a technician named Daniel plugged my device into a secure station and explained that they would analyze login activity between 9 p.m. and midnight the previous night. He spoke in a calm, procedural tone, as if this were an everyday audit. I sat in a chair across from him, watching lines of system data scroll across his monitor. At 2:34 p.m., he pointed to a timestamp showing access to the shared drive at 11:56 p.m. under my credentials. My stomach tightened again. He explained that the login originated from the company network rather than a remote connection. I told him that I had been at home at that time and that my laptop had not been connected to the office network. He nodded and said that sometimes credentials can be used on different terminals if permissions allow, but he would need to confirm. That statement landed heavily. If someone inside the building had used my credentials, it meant intent. At 3:05 p.m., he printed a preliminary report and said it would be forwarded to leadership. I returned to my desk without my laptop, which they kept for further review, and felt the absence immediately. Without access to my usual tools, I was left with little to do except wait. Around 3:30 p.m., Jason approached quietly and asked if I wanted to grab coffee downstairs. I agreed, needing a moment away from the fluorescent lights and whispered conversations. As we stood in line at the cafe on the first floor, he lowered his voice and said he had noticed something odd the night before. He had been working late and left around 10:45 p.m., and he recalled seeing Olivia still in her office with the lights on. He did not think much of it at the time because she occasionally stayed late, but the memory now felt relevant. I asked if he was certain about the time, and he said he checked the clock near the elevators because he did not want to miss the 10:52 p.m. train. That detail stuck with me. If Olivia had been in the building close to midnight, and if the revised file had been modified on the company network at 11:58 p.m., the timeline began to align in a way that made my pulse quicken. I did not accuse her. I did not even suggest it out loud. I simply thanked Jason for telling me. When we returned upstairs at 4:10 p.m., I noticed that Olivia's door was closed. Through the glass panel, I could see her typing steadily, expression focused, as if nothing unusual had occurred in the past 24 hours. At 4:42 p.m., an email from Mark appeared in my inbox requesting that I join him and the chief financial officer again at 5:15 p.m. to review preliminary findings. From Information Technology, the timing felt deliberate, as if the entire day had been building toward this next conversation. I glanced at the clock in the corner of my screen, realizing that it had been almost exactly 24 hours since I had walked into Mark's office expecting a routine conversation. Instead, I was preparing to defend not just a spreadsheet, but my integrity, knowing that whatever was said in that room would likely define how everyone in this building saw me from that point forward. At 5:15 p.m., I walked back into Mark's office, this time without the optimism that had filled the same space the previous afternoon. The skyline outside his window was beginning to glow with the orange light of early evening, almost identical to the moment he had congratulated me, and the contrast was not lost on me. The chief financial officer was already seated, a thin stack of printed logs resting on the desk between them. Mark gestured for me to sit, and for a few seconds no one spoke. Finally, the chief financial officer began summarizing the preliminary findings from Information Technology. He explained that at 11:56 p.m., a login session had been initiated on a workstation inside the office using my credentials. The system confirmed that the device was physically connected to the company network on the 12th floor. The session lasted approximately 11 minutes, during which the Westbrook file was accessed and modified. My laptop, according to its own log, had not been active at that time. Hearing that distinction felt like the first breath of air after being underwater all day. I asked whether the workstation could be identified. The chief financial officer nodded and said the access originated from a terminal assigned to the analytics team, not from my desk specifically, but from a shared workstation near the secondary conference area. That narrowed the field but did not eliminate suspicion. Mark leaned back in his chair and asked whether I had any explanation for how someone could have used my credentials on site. I told them again that I do not share passwords and that I log out when I leave. The chief financial officer then mentioned that security footage was being reviewed to determine who remained on the floor close to midnight. The mention of footage made my pulse steady instead of race. If there were cameras, then there would be proof. Mark's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained cautious. He said that while the preliminary report suggested I was not physically present during the modification, the fact that my credentials were used still represented a lapse in account security, and leadership expected higher vigilance from someone stepping into a leadership role. I accepted that criticism without argument. Protecting my login was my responsibility, even if I had not knowingly compromised it. Then Mark added that until the review was fully concluded, the promotion would remain suspended. The word suspended felt heavier than placed on hold. I asked directly whether they believed I had intentionally altered the projections. There was a pause before Mark responded that they were keeping an open mind and focusing on facts. It was not an accusation, but it was not a vote of confidence either. As the meeting ended, the chief financial officer said that final conclusions would be communicated within the next day once security footage had been analyzed. I stood up, thanked them for the update, and walked out feeling both vindicated and unsettled. The data showed I had not been at that workstation at 11:58 p.m., which meant someone else had logged in as me. That realization brought relief, but it also introduced a sharper truth. This was not a simple mistake. It was deliberate. Someone had taken the time to access a shared terminal late at night, use my credentials, adjust key financial assumptions, and leave my name attached to the changes. As I stepped back onto the main floor, I scanned the rows of desks with new awareness. Every keyboard, every monitor, every closed office door felt like a potential clue. At 5:48 p.m., most employees were preparing to leave, conversations light and routine, unaware of the quiet investigation unfolding behind closed doors. I gathered my belongings slowly, aware that the next 24 hours would determine not only whether my title would be restored, but whether I could ever look at this office the same way again, knowing that someone inside it had decided to test how easily my reputation could be rewritten. I barely slept that night, checking my phone every hour as if an email might arrive at 2 a.m. and instantly restore everything that had unraveled. By 6:30 a.m., I was already awake, staring at the ceiling and calculating how quickly a reputation can shift inside a single building. At 7:18 a.m., my phone buzzed with a calendar update from Mark requesting my presence at 9 a.m. in conference room B for a final review discussion. The wording was concise, almost sterile. No emojis, no reassurance, just a time and a location. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, the hallway lights still bright against the quiet floor. Olivia was already at her desk when I walked in. She looked up briefly, offered a polite nod, and returned to her screen. There was no sign of anxiety in her posture, no visible tension in her expression. At 8:57 a.m., I stepped into conference room B and found Mark, the chief financial officer, Claire from Human Resources, and a representative from Information Technology seated around the table. The atmosphere felt decisive, not exploratory. The Information Technology representative began by summarizing the completed review. Security footage from the 12th floor between 11:30 p.m. and midnight showed only 2 employees present in the analytics wing. A facilities staff member performing routine cleaning and Olivia Brooks working at a shared workstation near the secondary conference area. The timestamp on the footage showed her seated at that terminal at 11:57 p.m., with the monitor clearly active. My heart pounded, but I remained silent. The representative continued, explaining that login records confirmed my credentials were entered at that exact workstation at 11:56 p.m., and the Westbrook file was modified shortly after. There was no evidence that I had entered the building that evening, and badge access logs confirmed I had left at 5:41 p.m. the previous day. Mark folded his hands on the table and looked at me before turning toward Olivia, who had been asked to join midway through the summary. She entered the room at 9:05 a.m., composed as ever, but when the Information Technology representative repeated the timeline in her presence, her expression tightened slightly. Mark asked her directly whether she had accessed the Westbrook file using my credentials. She initially responded that she had stayed late to review materials and that she might have opened shared documents, but she denied intentionally altering projections. The information technology representative then explained that keystroke logs showed manual input changes to specific growth rate cells and cost assumptions during that 11-minute session. Silence filled the room. Claire reminded everyone that honesty at this stage was critical. After a long pause, Olivia admitted that she had used a previously saved session on the shared workstation that remained logged in under my account. She said she noticed the aggressive assumptions earlier in the day and wanted to demonstrate how vulnerable the model was by exaggerating them further, believing leadership would question the projections and reconsider the promotion decision. She claimed she did not expect the situation to escalate so quickly. Hearing that explanation felt surreal. The decision to manipulate the file was framed as a misguided test rather than a calculated attempt to damage my credibility. Mark's expression hardened, and the chief financial officer stated clearly that altering official financial documents without authorization violated company policy and ethical standards. Claire outlined immediate steps, including a formal review of Olivia's conduct. I remained quiet, absorbing the reality that the past 24 hours had been triggered not by an error in my work, but by someone else's decision to interfere. Mark then turned to me and said that based on the evidence, leadership recognized that I had not modified the projections and that the suspension of my promotion would be lifted effective immediately. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with something heavier. The title was being restored, but the innocence of the moment when I first earned it was gone. As the meeting concluded around 9:32 a.m., I understood that although the facts had cleared my name, the experience had permanently changed how I viewed ambition, trust, and the quiet competition that can exist behind polite smiles in a corporate office. When I walked out of conference room B at 9:32 a.m., the floor looked exactly the same as it had the day before, yet nothing about it felt familiar anymore. The same gray carpet, the same hum of printers, the same skyline beyond the windows, but now every detail carried context I did not have 24 hours earlier. Mark followed me out and asked if I had a moment. We stepped into his office, and this time his tone was noticeably different. He said the leadership team regretted the premature suspension and acknowledged that the evidence clearly demonstrated I had not altered the projections. He also said that stepping into leadership often reveals dynamics that are not visible from the outside. It was a careful way of admitting that politics exist even in companies that claim they reward merit alone. He confirmed that my promotion to team lead would be formally announced again by noon, and that the client presentation would proceed with the original projections restored. I thanked him, but my gratitude felt measured. At 10:07 a.m., the department-wide email went out confirming my new role and briefly noting that a technical review had clarified recent discrepancies. There was no mention of names, no public explanation, just a sanitized version of events. Within minutes, messages began to appear in my inbox. Congratulations again. Well deserved. Glad everything got sorted out. The tone was supportive, yet I could sense an undercurrent of curiosity in the hallway conversations. Olivia's desk was empty by late morning. I later learned she had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal review. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated in a dramatic way. Instead, I felt aware that ambition can blur judgment, aware that trust in a corporate environment is often conditional. Around 12:30 p.m., I held my first official team meeting as team lead. I stood at the front of the conference room, looked at the faces of colleagues who had watched my credibility questioned less than a day earlier, and spoke about transparency, accountability, and protecting the integrity of our work. I did not reference what happened directly, but the message was clear. Systems matter. Documentation matters. Ethics matter. After the meeting, Jason stopped by my desk and said he was glad the truth came out. I thanked him for telling me about seeing Olivia late that night. That small observation had helped anchor the timeline in my mind when everything felt uncertain. As the afternoon unfolded, I reopened the Westbrook model one more time, this time with full access restored. I reviewed each cell carefully, not because I doubted my work, but because I understood how fragile perception can be. A single modification attached to the wrong name had nearly rewritten my professional story. At 4:52 p.m., exactly one day after I had first shaken Mark's hand, I glanced at the clock and let the symmetry sink in. In 24 hours, I had experienced recognition, doubt, isolation, investigation, and reinstatement. The promotion meant something different now. It was not just a title or a raise. It was a reminder that leadership is not only about performance metrics and quarterly growth. It is about resilience when your name is questioned, composure when assumptions shift, and clarity when others test your credibility. I learned that documentation is protection, that quiet competition can escalate quickly, and that how you respond under scrutiny can define you more than any congratulatory email ever could. As the office lights dimmed and people prepared to head home, I packed my bag with a steadier sense of perspective. The skyline outside Mark's window looked the same as it had the day before, but I understood now that success is not measured only by how high you rise, but by how firmly you stand when someone tries to lower you in front of everyone else.